Everyone. I'm James Person, Senior Faculty Lead for Korea Studies at Johns Hopkins SAIS. I want to thank you all for joining us for this very meaningful discussion on the Gwangju massacre, which occurred, of course, 40 years ago this year when Chun Doo-hwan ordered a deadly crackdown on pro-democracy demonstrators in the southwestern provincial capital of Gwangju. The Gwangju Uprising began as a student-led demonstration against Chun Doo-hwan after he expanded martial law and arrested prominent opposition politicians like Kim Dae-jung. Shortly after the protests began, elite paratroopers who were untrained in crowd control attacked the students with baton, rifles, and bayonets, killing many. But as the crackdown escalated, so did the resistance of the citizens. Eventually, Gwangju erupted into open rebellion, with residents raiding a local armory, seizing weapons, and driving the paratroopers out of the city. They established citizen rule in the city and issued appeals to the United States for support and to mediate discussions with Seoul. A few days later, the military returned, however, crushing the civilian movement. To this day, we do not know, or we do not have an accurate count on the number of men, women, and children who were killed in Gwangju between May 18th and May 27th, 1980. The violence unleashed a wave of anger at the United States, which had long backed Korea's military rulers as a way to counter North Korea. Ever since the United States and the Soviet Union divided Korea in 1945 and the US Army occupied South Korea, the military had been a primary player in relations between Washington and Seoul. Because Koreans are aware of this, they, of course, can't believe that the United States had nothing to do with Korean military actions in 1980. In 1996, journalist Tim Shorrock obtained documents through the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA request, that seemed to lend, and these documents seemed to lend some support to the idea that the United States was aware of Chun's planned use of troops, specifically the 20th Division, to establish control in Gwangju. Since those documents came or were released, we've also seen a number of biographies or autobiographical accounts by very senior level officials, including Ambassador William Gladstein, who of course was ambassador to Seoul during the events of 1980, and by General John Wickham, who served as the Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command, the commander of the U.S. Forces Korea, and of the 8th Army in Korea. So we have these very senior level accounts. Today, we are joined by two distinguished U.S. veteran officials who, in 1980, were more at the working level, but were directly involved in Korean affairs. We have with us Ambassador Robert Rich. Ambassador Rich, I could spend the entire time of our seminar going over their distinguished credentials, but if I can just briefly go through them. Ambassador Rich joined the Navy in 1952, served till 54, and then joined the Foreign Service in 1957. He was in Korea or involved in Korean affairs during many of the most important periods in Korea's long struggle for democratization and many important flashpoints in U.S.-Korea relations. He was first assigned to Korea as a political affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy in Seoul from 1959 to 1962. It was during this time, of course, that Syngman Rhee was forced out of office in the April 19th revolution of 1960. It was also during his tenure in Seoul that Major General Park Chung-hee seized power in a May 1961 coup d'etat. Ambassador Rich then served in Indonesia and on the Indonesia desk at State Department from 1962 to 69, and became senior watch officer in the Operations Center until 1971. Then entered the National War College for a year and returned to diplomatic service in 1974 when he became Deputy Chief of Mission at the U.S. Embassy in Port of Spain, Trinidad and Tobago. He became Director of Korean Affairs in the State Department from 1977 to 1981, back again at a very pivotal time during the assassination of Park Chung-hee, and during the period during which Chun Doo-hwan launched a slow motion coup d'etat on December 12th of 1979, which of course led to the events that we'll discuss today, the Gwangju massacre. Ambassador Rich later served as deputy chief of mission at the U.S. Embassy in Manila in the Philippines from 82 to 85, and was placed in charge of special projects on U.S. relations with the Philippines. And in 1987 was named ambassador to Belize, where he served until 1990. We are also joined by Colonel James Young, who has also been involved in Korean affairs for several decades. He entered the Army as a lieutenant in 1963 after finishing law school, following service in Korea, Hawaii, and in the United States on assignments. He was posted to the 1st Infantry Division in Vietnam, where he served as an operations officer and company commander. Following Vietnam duty, he studied Korean in Monterey, California, and then earned a master's degree in international relations from the University of South Carolina, and then returned to Korea on assignments and to the Pentagon, and then became an Army Attaché to Korea, where he was personally cited by the Secretary of Defense and the American ambassador for special contributions during the 1979 Korean military coup d'etat of Chun Doo-hwan and subsequent events, including especially Gwangju. So a graduate of the Army War College, he served as special assistant to Secretary of Defense Caspar Weinberger during the Reagan administration. His final Army posting was Defense Attaché in Seoul, Korea again. So many years of involvement with Korea that continued even after he left the Army, with, of course, many military awards and decorations. But so after his Army service, he became president of Pacific Associates and a consultant to senior management of several major American companies. He won major contracts for clients and negotiated the first and only commercial agreement between an American company and North Korea. He's published his memoirs. They were a bestseller in Korea in 1994. And then the English version was published in 2003 under the name Eye on Korea. I encourage you all to read it. It's available on Amazon or on Kindle. So today's meeting is part of a broader oral history project that we're carrying out at SAIS with the U.S. That looks at key points in U.S.-Korea relations, and we're doing this in cooperation with the Korea Development Institute School, which is our partner. We held last December in Seoul a seminar that brought us just up to Gwangju. We looked at the assassination of Park Chung-hee, right up to the 12/12 coup that brought Chun Doo-hwan to power. We had intended to hold a follow-up critical oral history conference this year, just on Gwangju, and still hope to do so after the pandemic, so we can get a better understanding of this horrific event and milestone in Korea's struggle for democratization. But Ambassador Rich and Colonel Young were both involved with this project in Seoul last year and continue to work with us. We're delighted to welcome them today to engage in a discussion about the events of Gwangju, about what they knew, how they learned it, and about new materials that have become available since. So we're joined by Ambassador Rich and Colonel Young. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
So we'll start I will ask you to just give us some opening remarks. What on sort of your broader thoughts on the events for some 40 years later. Colonel Young, you were the boots on the ground. According to your memoir, you were even considering flying down and investigating yourself. If you wouldn't mind getting us started off with your with your broader recollections.
Well, thanks, James. It might be valuable, I think, to back up a little bit and kind of lay a little background before Gwangju to kind of set the stage. As you recall, after 12/12, when we met in Seoul, the next big event was 12/14, which I believe was even more significant because that's when Chun Doo-hwan put all of his supporters into the power positions in the army. So after 12/14, I was surprised that there was no more resistance to that move within the army, but they seemed to accept it. And things really, except for a couple of incidents, kind of calmed down in Korea. And until probably April of 1980, it looked like we were making some progress. The martial law had been modified to allow some political participation by the three Kims at that time, Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, and
Kim Jong-pil.
Kim Jong-pil, yeah, who was not as active, which is probably why I couldn't remember his name. At any rate, in the middle of April, the first catalyst, I believe, for the events that resulted in Gwangju was the appointment of Chun Doo-hwan to the CIA, KCIA. And at that time, there were two power centers in Korea, de facto power centers. That was the Army and the KCIA. So once he got the KCIA appointed people that were his supporters there, he controlled them both. You know, everybody understood that. So that was kind of the catalyst for a lot more student demonstrations. There was some labor unrest. There was a big strike, minor strike over on the East Coast that turned violent and some deaths, and countrywide demonstrations, really. Mostly student demonstrations, but a few civilians as well. About 3 or 4 days before the Gwangju mess began, I was in my office sorting out some papers, and I got a call from Colonel Lee, who was the Foreign Liaison Office, and he said, "No Tae-woo would like to see you." No Tae-woo at the time was Chun Doo-hwan's number 2. He was different from Chun. Chun was more outspoken and kind of abrasive and direct. No Tae-woo was much more thoughtful, I thought, a little different personality. Saw a little wider picture than Chun, but of course he was a Chun supporter and had supported him by moving some of his troops during 12/12. I said, "Sure." And when does he want to see me? And he says, "Well, there's a car outside the embassy right now." I go downstairs, get in the car, and off we went. When we got to his headquarters, which was the Capitol Security Command, and it's located, its headquarters is located over by the old Korea houses, which is kind of a tourist restaurant, but most people know where that is. When we entered, I noticed, first of all, that they appeared to be in a high state of readiness. Their vehicles were all turned outwards for deployment. They had soldiers manning them. They had weapons. It was a little unusual state of readiness, I thought. We went up, sat down, had the customary ginseng tea, and I did mostly listening. No Tae-woo talked for about an hour. He talked about his early days at the Korean Military Academy, that it was founded by General Van Fleet, that we had the curriculum was stressed the democratic ideals. He was familiar with the writings of Thomas Jefferson. And then he talked about the long-standing friendship between the U.S. and Korea, but he also talked about how we were different, and particularly our borders were different. We had relatively secure borders and friendly people on both sides. He did, Korea was quite different with the North Korean threat. And he said, you know, we will not allow instability to continue. I went back to the embassy. By then it was long after duty hours. Wrote a report because I thought this information should be back in Washington pronto. Sent the report on my own authority. Normally it would have been coordinated with the political section in the ambassador's office, because the ambassador had met with Chun Doo-hwan a couple of days earlier and had sent a rather more optimistic cable. So I certainly wanted to clear it with him, but I didn't, because it was weekend and I thought we'd better get this off to Washington. About 3 days later, maybe 2 days later, on Sunday the 17th, they declared full martial law. This amounted to seizing all the media, closing down the universities, and in what is probably the most boneheaded political move ever, they arrested Kim Dae-jung, Kim Young-sam, and Kim Jong-pil. So Kim Jong-pil, I think, was more house arrest, but Kim Dae-jung was the real target. And that was the catalyst for Gwangju. We did not know what was going on in Gwangju until, I believe, the 19th, even though they started, there was a reserve division and the local police, the provincial police, and they were unable or unwilling to control the demonstrations. And that's apparently, in retrospect, when the special forces were committed. They were obviously not the right group. They had no riot training. They were trained to get North Koreans and do them in. Their officers lost control. It was a recipe for disaster, and that's exactly what happened. We had no OPCON over those forces. They were deployed without our knowledge, and we didn't even find out really what was happening until probably the 19th or 20th. And I had a friend, an officer who was from Gwangju, who I met with on the 20th, and he said he had talked to his parents and it was really bad, and described the situation with bodies in the street and that sort of thing. So that's really, I think, about the 20th or 21st before we really figured out what the situation was. We didn't have any reporting assets in Gwangju. There was a USIS officer, and there was a two-man MI office, which was on the base, the air base at Gwangju, and there were some missionaries. So this is where we were getting our information, and that's the reason it took so long for us to react and to understand the severity of the situation. Later, the 20th Division went down, and they pretty much there were some negotiations and some other things, but I'll stop there and turn it over to Bob. But that's kind of what happened on the ground there.
Great, and we'll come back and ask some follow-up questions. Thank you, Colonel Young. Ambassador Rich.
Well, as Jim has stated, the American policy at this period was to try to persuade the military, who clearly had the bit in its teeth in Korea after the assassination, and was the power on the scene. But our effort was to try to persuade them to allow a constitutional civilian progress toward democracy. This was very important to the United States, and it was very important to us also because we believe this is what the Korean people wanted, that there was a real popular desire for a move toward democracy. And while we could not control matters and internal affairs of another country, we used our assets to try to persuade the military that this was in their own interest in the long term to move towards a democratic denouement of that crisis period. The assumption of the KCIA post by General Chun, we considered a very backward, unfortunate move. We were definitely did not think that was a good thing to have done, and it was an ominous portrayal of what was to happen. And then the arrest of all three of the principal civilian candidates. I guess I can call even Kim Jong-il civilian by that point. The arrest of Kim Dae-jung and the others, and the institution of strict martial law was a power play which we were definitely not informed about in advance. We did not approve of it. It was not in the American interest, and we didn't think it was in Korea's interests. As Colonel Young has stated, we had no involvement in the Special Forces repression of the demonstrations in Gwangju. Were parts of the military that were not under Combined Forces Command because they were not part of the armed forces that were functioned in the planning for the defense of the country. As I would really say, those who feel we should have somehow been able to prevent that deployment, I can only say, as I think Ambassador Gleistein once said, anyone who thinks that as a foreign country that we could have determined how another nation uses its internal security forces must be, we would soon be thrown out very quickly. That would be rejected by any foreign country at all. And General Wickham, in his authority as Combined Forces Commander, had no authority over those special forces or how they were used. In Washington, I think the principal perception we had at the time was that we were very slow to really understand what was going on in Gwangju. We were even, of course, further removed from it than Colonel Young and our people in Seoul. And most of the information we were receiving was what the Korean military wanted us to hear and their version of events. And we were only getting fragmentary and belated information. So in real time, we did not understand the nature of the brutality and the tragedy that was really going on down there. This sort of came slowly and belatedly to us. As time went on, naturally, given our perspectives and the years of conviction that the North Koreans were wanted to try to exploit any unrest in South Korea or any separation of the South Korean from the United States to carry out a long-term program of reconquest. And this feeling, this came out of a knowledge also that at that period of time, the North Koreans had sacrificed tremendously to produce a military capability that was useful to do that very thing. That they were a very dangerous a potential opponent at that stage in history for use of an expensive and asset that they had acquired. So yes, we were concerned at extended spreading unrest in the country could create an external threat, and that the United States did make an effort to make it clear in Pyongyang, in Moscow, and in Beijing that any interference would immediately bring reaction of the most severe kind from the United States. But this was not to say that internally in South Korea we found this the military action most unfortunate. As the days went on, however, we could not deny that we felt that there needed to be a restoration of order in the country because of the external threat produced by a sense internationally, a perception that the country was in revolution or in disarray. So when it came to the restoring order in Gwangju, again, without our understanding at the time of the depth of the initial problem that had been created by the special forces. It is true that we did not oppose the restoration of order, but we made every effort through General Wickham, through the ambassador and others. The policy in Washington was to try to insist that every effort be made to prevent any further bloodshed, but to try to restore order as quickly as possible and as orderly as possible. And in that context, it's my understanding, and Colonel Young, you may be able to correct me on this. I believe that the forces that were sent down to restore order were chopped from Combined Forces Command at the request of the Korean Armed Forces, a unit which was trained for riot control and was expected to handle themselves in a more humane manner. They were requested to be released from the Combined Forces Command Authority for use in domestic affairs. That request was approved, and frankly, the U.S. position was that we had that General Wickham, in fact, as commander, had no basis on which to deny such a request from the Korean government. It's simply an acknowledgement that a small force could be temporarily unavailable for defense plans, operational plans, and without jeopardizing the safety of the country. And that does not go so far as to approve how they are used. That was not within our authority as foreigners. That was the perception we had from Washington of a very, very unfortunate situation, the brutality of which we were very slow to understand, all of it occurring against the policies which we had been urging on the Korean military, all of it in opposition to the hopes that we had for democratic development in Korea at that time. I know that my immediate boss, the Assistant Secretary for East Asian Affairs, Richard Holbrook, was away at much of this time in Geneva, and so we were communicating by telephone as well as cable. And when the military did go back into Gwangju and restored order, and that word came to us from Seoul that the city was back under the authority of the central government. I don't remember what time of day it was because we'd been losing a lot of sleep, but I do remember that one of the last things I did was send a note to Assistant Secretary Holbrook, who was not there, saying, one of these days there are going to be monuments erected in Gwangju, but they're not going to be monuments to the Korean military. I would only note that I had one further small involvement in Gwangju several years later. This was at the time that the parliament in Seoul was requesting information from the United States on our involvement in the Gwangju incident. And the powers in Washington at that time, essentially, their reaction was, let's just not have anything to do with this. We'll claim diplomatic immunity. Just don't get involved in their affairs. My successor in those days was a man named Dunlap. And the Dunlap felt we should be cooperative. We should try to be cooperative because we really had nothing to hide. And so requests went out to Ambassador Gleistein, who was then retired, and to myself. I was in the Philippines. And both of us went back to our messages to Washington that by all means, cooperate completely. We had nothing to hide. Neither one of us, and we did consult with each other, neither one of us felt that there was anything that we knew about that was that we were ashamed of, or that we felt was in any way collusion in what had happened and the tragedy that had occurred. And yes, we should cooperate. And with that encouragement from the two of us, Washington did decide to go ahead and participate in responding positively to the Korean Parliament. I think I'll stop there and see where we go.
Great. Thank you very much, Ambassador Rich. Colonel Young. I will just ask a few questions, and then we'll open it up to questions from attendees. I guess, so both of you, well, Ambassador Rich in particular, you touched upon the idea that the 20th Division was trained for riot control, whereas the special forces were not, and the level of brutality carried out by these paratroopers early on, as you said, got out of hand. And even their officers couldn't control them. I guess so. So there's a lot of perception that, given the fact that the United States did know that the 20th Division would be moved, there's the implication here that this suggests complicity. But Colonel Young, in your book, you describe how, well, there was almost, after what happened in 12/12 of 79, where the Koreans did use forces that were under the combined forces without authorization, they were very, very much keeping the U.S. informed in May of 1980 of any desire to use troops and of their plans, almost to the point where Chun was trying to entrap the U.S.
Yes.
by saying, look, you're in this with us. You know, but the logic behind, so the U.S. again had no authorization to say, yes, you will, but you will use these for X, Y, Z, but simply to acknowledge the request being submitted to detach temporarily, to make unavailable for combined forces operations the 20th Division. But in your book, you describe how the 20th Division, how you looked at this as, okay, well, these folks actually do have the training, and therefore it would be, I don't want to say beneficial, but it would be better to actually have them on the ground than those special forces without the training. Am I?
Yes, that's generally right. The 20th Division, as I recall, a division has 3 brigades. 2 of those brigades were removed long before this. I think after 12/12, maybe even after the assassination. So most of the discussion was about the other brigade. And it was one, I guess, that had the most riot control training. We definitely thought that it would be the best option, and it turned out that when they went back in on the 26th or 27th, it was successful. There was not much bloodshed. I think maybe 2 or 3 soldiers were killed. There were some holdouts in Gwangju, maybe 20 or so, and they were dispatched. But you're right, because the Korean military at the time was, the last 2 or 3 days of Gwangju was very cooperative. They brought us into all their discussions, and I'm sure the reason for that was so that they could say, okay, the U.S. approved. Now, under OPCOM procedures, there's no approval mechanism. They are just withdrawn. We are notified. Normally, we would request some sort of reserve unit be assigned in place of it, but we did not really approve it, but we were very much consulted.
Thank you. I want to ask, so do you feel that, so Ambassador Rich, you pointed out that immediately after 12/12, and as Colonel Young pointed out, 12/14, which is when a very important date when Chun Doo-hwan actually began appointing his people in positions of authority. From that period, the U.S. government was really trying to encourage Chun and the government to make the transition to a constitutional amendment to free and democratic elections, direct presidential elections. What do you think that just in hindsight, do you think the U.S. could have done more to encourage this? Do you feel that Colonel Young, in your memoirs, again, you suggest that you feel that more could have been done? I leave that for either of you or both of you to comment on. What more do you think we could have done to encourage Chun, or do you think that Chun was already determined to seize power and it was just a matter of time?
It's a difficult situation. I was relatively junior at the time. I was the Army Attaché. I had a colonel above me. And, junior people always think they have better ideas than the senior people. Now, once I became a senior person, I realized how wrong I was about that. But at the time, I thought there were some things that we could have done. I thought One, we could have forcefully disavowed Chun Duan and the 1212 group. We had a lot of contacts, all of us, where we could use those contacts to set the record straight. They control the media, and on several times, and Ambassador Gleistein's book has a lot of detail on this, on the statements that we tried to make to the Korean people. They said, okay, we'll do it, and they never did. They just did not cooperate, and when they did, sometimes they just flat out lied about our involvement. We had a leaflet operation, which I was much in favor of. We could have dropped leaflets all over Gwangju, saying this is our position, no more bloodshed, negotiation. We were prepared and had the planes ready to go, the helicopters. The Koreans said, oh, there's going to be an airspace management problem or something, which was baloney. And so anyhow, the leaflets were never dropped. We could have challenged their distortions maybe more forcefully, but again, the only real outlet we had was AFKN, the military channel there, and they are under some guidelines too to be able to operate in a foreign country. We could have withdrawn the ambassador, maybe overtly supported the opposition figures. There are pros and cons for both of those, and some diplomatic problems. But at the time, I thought we should have reacted a little more forcefully than we did. To go back to the special forces just for a second, there's still some belief that General Wickham was involved in that. General Wickham was not in Korea until about the 19th, long after this happened. He came in on kind of the tail end, so there's no way that he was involved in that.
I would like to.
I thought we could have been a little more forceful.
Yeah, I'll second what Colonel Young says. Back to the Gwangju itself. The problems we face today in communications with the Korean public stem from that period when the military were making every effort to portray the United States as approving of what they were doing. And one thing I wish we could have done more was in that public sphere of somehow getting the word out better to the Korean people that we had not approved this, and we did not think it was a good idea. But there was a conscious campaign, and the military controlled the media. Now, we did do one thing. We did relax the constraints on the Armed Forces radio in Korea to be able to report in full some of the statements that the U.S. government was making. But to have done so, that was in English, and we could only hope that at least it got to some of the elites and could percolate down. But it was, looking backwards, it's clear that who dominated the media at the time, and those perceptions still linger today. So,
do you think so? Of course, one of the restraints was that this is a sovereign country, and that you don't want to do anything, so there's this limited ability to act without the support of the ROK government, lest they decide to toss us out of the country. did the Chun government message that it felt capable of defending itself from the DPRK without U.S. support? Was this just an empty threat? It's just.
I think we felt at the time. Let's go back to the general effort, sort of an all full court press that had been going on ever since the assassination. From our perspective, there were three options that could happen ahead. One, you could have a military takeover, clearly the strongest institution in the country at the time. Two, you could have a progression towards a democratic government, which was what we hoped for. Three, you could have a revolution, because, and the problem with standing by and the prospect of a revolution was, again, the external threat, which was of great concern to us as well. So it was not the US position to stand by completely and allow disruptive forces to perhaps develop towards a revolution. But everything we could do, we felt to try to restrain the military from aggrandizement of its power and allow not a revolutionary change, but there was at least a constitutional mechanism, not popular with everyone, because the incumbents had their position under the Pak Chung-hee autocratic government, but it allowed, the constitutional arrangements did allow for a progression towards democracy, and it was using that constitutional structure that we hoped to stimulate in two ways. Everything that the US government did was designed to enhance the prestige of that civilian framework government because of the public relationships with the president and those things. So at the same time, through all the channels available to us to keep telling the generals what a bad idea it would be for them to short circuit this process and take over overt power. Now, there was no question that we understood at this time that Chun Doo-hwan and others of the 12th class really were the power on the ground. But if they could use restraint, we felt there was a pathway forward that could lead to a more democratic government. That was what we hoped for. So yes, there was always the imminent threat of the military just taking over, which they eventually did. But at the same time, there was the latent threat of a degree of unrest that would reach disruptive potential in the country. And that, to some degree, was the danger that Gwangju sort of waved at everybody. I just give that sort of as context of where we were.
Okay. Thank you. Colonel Young, did you?
I agree with what Bob said. I don't have anything really to add to it.
All right. I have, before we open to questions from the audience, I guess one final question from me about, so we shared ahead of this event some documents with that were released for the 40th anniversary. There were, of course, the materials that became available in 1996. But we now have these additional documents that were released. from the embassy in Seoul for the 40th anniversary. We have them on the website of the Korea Data and History Initiative, which is the our KDHI, which is a new research portal that we're going to be launching very soon. The link for which everyone could access through the event announcement. Curious if you found anything interesting or new, or I mean, no smoking guns, but was there anything interesting that you found or even omitted? What were some? Did you have any thoughts about these new materials and what they tell us or don't tell us?
They reinforced my my memory of events. The real pity is that most of our interaction with Chun Doo-hwan from 1212 on was done by Bob Brewster, the special assistant, and he has some very interesting cables, and I don't think you're ever going to see them released. You know, they don't release stuff, and mine went to all my reports went to DIA, the Defense Intelligence Agency, which would be the release authority, and I don't think they'll be released either. So, you know, that's just an institutional deal. But
no, you said that his cables were, so Bob Brewster's cables were interesting. What, give us a little bit of a, so I know, again, from your memoir, I know that you think he had his impression of Chun, and he was the one who was meeting Chun primarily, even before Ambassador Glestein. His impression was somewhat more favorable than that of people in the U.S. military establishment.
I think that's a fair assumption. I think they had a good relationship. It was professional, and I think Bob was more optimistic about the future, and when they went to full martial law on the 17th, I think the relationship between Chun and Bob Brewster kind of bit the dust. That's my recollection.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I was in position in those days to read all of this traffic. The things that have been released are consistent with other things as well, although there are clearly not all the messages I have seen released yet. I think they probably are released somewhere in the processes of the National Archives, which are unfortunately very delayed these days. They're a bit overwhelmed with documentation. But it's Bob Brewster was all of his messages. He did some very insightful memoranda of his discussions with Chun, but all of that was in direct coordination with the ambassador because of Bob's had a professional hat that it allowed him to talk to Chun without it being a problem publicly, whereas when the ambassador talked to Chun at this stage, it gave Chun prestige that we were not trying to enhance publicly in terms of his power role. But I will say I felt that the country team was very much united on all of this. So nobody was playing games behind the scenes. While there are not even all the embassy messages have I seen yet in the released materials, I haven't seen anything that is counter to things that I haven't seen. And at this stage, it's hard to be very specific about what's missing. I do notice there's some deletions in the material that's been released. None of these are very significant. Having looked at them, I think they come in two categories. Some of them in those days, FOIA releases always delete any reference to the fact that our special assistant is concurring in what's said, but often embassies would say, an ambassador would include in a message that such a phrase as Cass agrees, something like this, which simply means what we know through intelligence does not conflict with or agrees with what I'm reporting to you. This is simply a reassuring statement that we don't have any competing information out there. Also, there are some deletions, even of Attaché, which I think were made to, at the time, protect, assuming we were protecting people who might be somehow hurt by knowledge that they talked to us, or at least that their views were controversial at the time. But these were not clandestine arrangements in any way, and I didn't notice any deletions that I thought could have any way interfered with the thrust of what's available to us.
Great, thank you. I'm going to turn to questions here, and I'm not going to necessarily go in the order in which they came, but one from Professor Won-Hyuk Lim, who is our partner from the Korea Development Institute School, he sends us a question that actually connects to this in some ways, and also connects to what you've been saying, Ambassador Rich, about the importance of stability and security, and brings up an important point where we were dealing more than with just what's happening in Korea. You also had, of course, the context of Iran. And so his question is, with the prior US setback in Iran in 1979 and perceived external threat from North Korea, the US seems to have put priority on maintaining order over democratization, and Ambassador Gleestein went so far as to meet with General Chun after 12/12, giving him credibility and prestige, as Colonel Young alluded to in his memoir. The distinction between notification versus authorization is nice, but after listening to Colonel Young and Ambassador Rich, I still don't understand why the US could not publicly disavow General Chun's attempt to entrap the US if the US had the will to do so. Statement, if you have any thoughts or if you views on that.
Well, public statements were made in Washington through the spokesman of the State Department, who met with the press daily in those days. And these were designed to make it clear we were not involved in or agreeing to what was going on. But frankly, these statements did not reach very far in Korea, to the extent we at some point tried to have them repeated by AFKN, but I don't think we simply were not effectively countering the military's statements effectively. I think we both feel that it was apparent at the time, and it was much more apparent since. So statements were made, but I think they didn't get anywhere.
I agree with Bob. It's hard to get your message out when the media is controlled by the other side.
So I guess building off that and going back to a question that was asked earlier, actually. So I think, Ambassador Rich, you mentioned that or it may have been, sorry, Colonel Young, restrictions were lifted on, for example, Armed Forces Radio, on the radio broadcasts. And so they had a little more bandwidth. Why didn't the Radio Korea broadcast have an option to go out in Korean? This comes from Sam Crosby, who's a recent graduate, and actually one of the developers of KDHI, the new Korea Data and History Initiative. So why, if we did limit or lift some restrictions, why didn't we permit them to actually broadcast in Korean so that the message got out to a broader audience in Korea, our message of not supporting Chun and his actions?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know if they're restricted into English or I just don't know. I know that they had some restrictions for their agreement to operate in Korea. That's a good question, and in retrospect, it probably would have been a good idea to do it. But AFKN has a limited audience in Korea, mostly English speakers, mostly military. Most of what they cover is stuff that military people are interested in. So I'm not sure it would have, even in Korean, that it would have reached a lot of people. But the Koreans that listen to it are mainly trying to learn English. I think they're English students.
Yeah, I don't know any details on this that I remember. We did try to do something through Voice of America, but in those days, Voice of America was broadcasting to Korea only on shortwave. So again, a limited audience. AFKN was not set up to broadcast in Korean. It would have been perceived as a direct interference in Korean affairs for us to use this English language channel for our own military's use as essentially a weapon against the ruling regime. I don't know anyone that was ever considered by anybody, but it would have been pretty much flaunting our power to do something against the sovereignty of Korea.
Right. Yeah, and certainly that high-handed approach or heavy-handed approach would have potentially damaged relations even further. A question from Brian Boyle, who is completing a doctorate. He's a doctorate in international affairs at SAIS, in working on Korea. It's a question for Colonel Young. He says, in your memoir, you mentioned how we put stability ahead of democracy, and we allowed the threat of North Korea to dominate our policy decisions surrounding 1212 and 518. And then you loosely attribute this to a possible overreaction due to the recent furor over intelligence estimates over Carter's plan to withdraw U.S. forces or USFK troops. I was wondering if you could elaborate on this, and do you think Carter had given up on or tried to distance himself from Korea by the time these events happened due to all of the political fallout he had gotten in the years prior?
Well, that may be, even though he's quoting me, Bob may have a better answer than I do about what was going on in Jimmy Carter's mind. Ambassador Gleistein's book is very thoughtful on the Carter withdrawal policy and has more details than mine. I would just say that there was so much institutional opposition to that it had no chance of getting through. There was a in-depth study of North Korean forces done, which kind of changed the threat posture and analysis. there was a lot of stonewalling in Washington, and Carter was president for 4 years, and that wasn't long enough to get that particular policy done. It was just too much institutional opposition and foot dragging and studies and that sort of thing.
Okay, thank you. Ambassador Rich, did you have any?
Well, essentially, at this time of Gwangju, I would say the president had sort of withdrawn from the field of battle on Korea. For several years, we had fought the battle internally in the US government to get him to change his policies on withdrawal. And finally, that point had been achieved after the June meetings in Seoul, and after the assassination. I did not feel in Washington that any sense that by the time of Gwangju that the president was engaged in the issue. But I felt we had fully as much authority as we needed for the U.S. policy of trying to encourage a democratic denouement of the ongoing crisis and to prevent the military from taking over. I know, I hear what the questioner is saying, that we took precedence of security over democracy. That's not how we saw it at the time. We saw all of our efforts, ineffective as they were, aimed at the democratic solution. But there are always those who feel that somehow we should have used force majeure to have prevented the military doing what it did, but that would have involved a much greater direct injection of American power into internal Korean affairs, which today would certainly be cited by all the questioners as a terrible overreach and a desecration of Korean sovereignty. So it's always nice if things go the way you want, but when they don't, you can always say, what more could we have done? And that's, at the time, we felt we were doing everything that could be reasonably done. But the question's out there. I can't answer it. What more one could have done?
Do you think do you think Ambassador Glacian's decision not to act as an intermediary, or do you think that, what's your assessment of that decision? Colonel
Not
Young, you suggested
First, I would say we were enormously fortunate to have Ambassador Gleistein as our ambassador during this crisis. He knew exactly what was happening. His insights were right on target, and we were really lucky to have him. As far as him being interjected somehow as an intermediary in Gwangju, there was nobody was in charge of Gwangju. It was a mess. There was, I think, very late in the game, about the time that the 20th Division went in and restored final order, there was a request through a very strange channel, like a New York Times reporter or something, that he should get involved as an intermediary, but it was hard to determine exactly the source of that and who you're going to talk to. So he's clean as a whistle on that, and he was a great ambassador. It would have been a lot worse if we hadn't had him.
The bottom line is that issue did not arise in a way and in a timely fashion that it would have ever really been evaluated. So it never was really discussed as an option. I would like to second what Colonel Young says there. If you have a very good ambassador and in a country well involved, then back in Washington, we are dependent upon the interpretations and the understandings of our people in the field. And of course, what you hear from newspapers and other things. But if you feel like the people on the scene are wise and are informed, we don't try to second guess them in Washington. You can always make mistakes pretty quickly if you pull a view out of the hat by somebody thousands of miles away. So we did trust what we were hearing, and I think rightly so. There are times when we have people on the scene who are not well cut in, and that causes a different kind of trouble.
Right. We have a question from Mitch Blatt, who is a graduate of the Korea Studies program. He says, over the past few years, and this kind of gets us to contemporary developments, Korean President Moon Jae-in has made efforts to release more information about the events of Gwangju, including making a Freedom of Information Act request directly to the US government. Do you think President Moon's re-examination of Gwangju has presented and or will present an opportunity?
Bob?
I don't
know anything about this subject.
I'm not familiar with it. In some years, for 12 years in retirement, I was running the State Department's systematic declassification program, but that's not FOIA. That's not the way you got these documents, right. But that's the up and down sort of release of documents after 25 years. And I don't know of any move or any reason to retain any of that material and classification insofar as the State Department is concerned. As Colonel Young has mentioned, the intelligence agencies and DIA and others sometimes are more resistant to releasing their material, although substantively I don't think there's any problem. It's usually for other reasons than substance. I don't think there's anything in our archives that changes anything we know today. So, and I'm pretty certain of that. I've seen an awful lot of stuff in the archives that has all sorts of labels on it that is supposed to keep it from public view. And I say quite honestly, I don't know of any hidden bombs on the subject.
Very good. That brings us just to just around 11:15. I want to thank you both very much for joining us. This is, of course, a very still a very controversial issue and very sensitive, and it was a tragic moment in Korean history that again there's still so much to learn in terms of we don't even know again the actual number of casualties, but an important event in Korea's struggle for democratization, and I thank all of you for joining us and for your questions.
May I comment just a moment? I just say, sure. As the director of Korean Affairs at the time, I would like to extend my sincere regrets at a great tragedy in Gwangju, one that will always be seen in Korean history as a tragedy, and I for any degree of lack of what we might have done, I apologize. We certainly certainly sympathize with those who suffered and their descendants, and we certainly applaud the vigor and dynamism of Korean democracy today.
Thank you, Ambassador Rich. Well, again, thank you all very much for joining us. Thank you both for a fascinating talk, and we look forward to moving forward once we're beyond this pandemic to continue our oral history project to further examine Gwangju in light of the evidence, and to bring in some folks from the Korean side as well to expand this conversation. So again, thanks everyone for joining, and I wish you all a very good day and happy holidays.
Thank you, James.
Thank you.